Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Mr. White here with your Unit 3 test review for K-Level. So you're going to want to go ahead and get out that yellow test review paper and follow along as we go over all the answers to help you get ready for this Unit 3 test. Alright, now, very first thing you need to know for the Unit 3 test is gross domestic product, or GDP. This means the total value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in a given period of time. So the first thing we need to know about in GDP is consumption. Consumption means goods and services purchased by households for personal use, like for example buying a new pair of shoes. We would call that C in our GDP equation for consumption. Remember that consumption is the biggest part of our GDP. It accounts for over 70%. Next up is investment. Remember, when we say investment in the context of GDP, we're talking about business investment. So what that means is money that businesses spend with the hopes that they can make more money in the future, hoping they can make a profit. So if Exxon built a new office building, that would be considered a type of gross investment. Gross investment just means that the total amount of investment that happens in the economy to help businesses make money. Okay, moving on, next up is government purchases or government spending. Government spending just means all the goods and services purchased by the government to benefit the country. So for example, if our government built a bunch of new roads, those roads are going to benefit us, but of course the government has to pay the workers, they have to pay for the concrete and the rebar and everything else that goes into making the road. So when the government purchases those goods or those services, that counts as government spending. And last up is net exports. Net exports means the value of all the goods and services that are sold to other countries, which is our exports, minus the value of all the goods and services that are purchased from other countries, our imports. It's easy to remember because exports exit, imports come in. So if Apple purchases 10 million iPhones from a manufacturer in China, that's what we would call net exports. So please remember that our formula to calculate GDP is consumption plus gross investment plus government spending plus net exports. So let's talk about the different types of goods that we would calculate into our GDP. For one thing, we don't calculate intermediate goods. Intermediate goods don't count because those are things that are used in the production of a final good or service. So the cheese that's on a McDonald's double cheeseburger. Late bus time, yeah. Hopefully you're not still at school when you're watching this, but if you are at school, go to the late bus, guys. Yeah, thanks, Ms. Pies. Okay, back to the review. So, intermediate goods are things that we use to create a final good or service. We only count final goods and services because we don't want to double count anything. Hopefully you remember GDP is a measure of what we produced. So we don't want to count the cheese and then count the cheeseburger because that would amount to double counting of the cheese, and we don't want that. Now, when we talk about goods that are counted, one of the goods that are counted can be called durable goods, or I guess you could say one category of goods that are counted are durable goods. Durable means long lasting, so durable goods are products that are intended to last longer than 3 years, like a car. A car would be an example of a durable good, and that's something that does count towards our GDP. Now the last kind of good is what we call a non-durable good, and as you might guess from the name, that means products that are not intended to last longer than 3 years, like a cup of coffee. Hopefully you're not keeping that cup of coffee for 3 years. It might be kind of gross after 3 years of sitting around. All right, now the business cycle. Remember that the business cycle shows our productivity. And so the way that it does that is by showing how real GDP changes over time. So this helps us understand the fluctuations of our economy. As a matter of fact, if you just take a look at that short answer question, flip over that yellow page, it's right there on the back, you'll see that this is pretty much the answer to part C on the short answer question. So if you get it wrong, it's because you didn't watch the video. That's why you watch the video, guys. All right, so first off, let's talk about the expansion phase of the business cycle. The expansion phase is when our GDP is increasing, and that causes the unemployment rate to go down, but unfortunately it causes the inflation rate to go up. So that means that when the economy is doing well, things are getting more expensive, and part of the reason why is because consumer demand is increasing due to the fact that our annual income is rising because so few people are unemployed during the expansion. Now the peak is the highest our GDP is going to go. Once our GDP hits the peak, it stops rising. But this is also when our unemployment rate stops falling. So keep in mind that the unemployment rate is falling all through the expansion phase until it hits the peak, and then the unemployment rate stops. This is also when inflation stops rising. So prices are going to stop rising once we hit the peak. Now the peak is the highest we can go, so obviously next we're going to start heading downwards, and that's when we head into what's known as the contraction phase. The contraction phase is when our GDP is decreasing. So our unemployment rate will start to increase, and our inflation rate will actually start to go down. Remember that during a contraction, prices usually fall because consumer demand falls. When there aren't a lot of people demanding goods and services, businesses have to lower their prices. So that makes sense why we would see prices go down during a contraction. Now, the final phase of the business cycle is called the trough. The trough is the lowest our GDP can possibly go. Once it hits the trough, it's not going to go down anymore, it's only going to start going back up. So in the trough, that's also when our unemployment rate stops rising and the inflation rate stops falling. Okay, so make sure you know these different phases of the business cycle. Once again, this particular slide will help you get about half of that question on the short answer. So make sure you know what to write for the short answer. Heck, if I was you, I would even write it out right now, memorize it, and as soon as you get to class, before you even do the multiple choice part of the test, just go ahead and get your 10 points for the short answer. It's so easy, guys. All right, types of unemployment. Now, the good kind of unemployment is called frictional unemployment, because that's when people are unemployed, not because they can't find a job or because there's something wrong with their skills, but because they're taking their time to find a job that really matches their skills or matches their job preference. So when you graduate college, you'll probably have lots of job interviews to go to. Even if the first job wants to hire you right away, you're probably going to turn down that job offer because you've got more interviews lined up. So when people feel confident about the economy, when the economy's strong and there's lots of options out there, people aren't just going to settle for any job. They're going to find the job that best matches their skills. Now, structural unemployment is another kind of unemployment that's considered positive for the economy, but boy, it really sucks if you're going through it. Structural unemployment is when people are unemployed because the skills they have are no longer needed, usually because there's been a fundamental change to the industry in which they work. So a perfect example of this could be employees of Blockbuster Video. Back before we had streaming video, Blockbuster was a really strong company and they had millions of employees. But as soon as Netflix and other streaming services became popular, companies like Blockbuster went away. And I don't think that's bad for the economy. As a matter of fact, I think most of us would agree that streaming video like Netflix is really good and it makes our life better. But if you're an employee who used to work for Blockbuster, you don't like Netflix. The reason why is because Netflix cost you your job. And if you really are set on working at a video store, it's going to take you a very long time to find another video store that'll hire you, because nowadays there's just not that many video stores available to work at. And so that's why structural unemployment, while it's good for the economy, is quite negative for the individual. Okay? Now, before we move on, it's also important to note frictional and structural unemployment are part of our natural rate of unemployment. So these are the kinds of unemployment that would be most common during the peak of the business cycle. Where have we seen that question before? Oh, I don't know. I guess you can look around on your test review and see, but hey, if you find it on there, then what do you know? I just gave you another answer. Isn't that cool? All right, so next up, cyclical unemployment. This is when unemployment is caused by a downturn of the business cycle. So when we're in a contraction, we're going to have cyclical unemployment. This kind of unemployment is really unhealthy for the economy because cyclical unemployment is any unemployment beyond our 4 to 6% natural unemployment rate. Once you get beyond the natural unemployment rate, it starts to decrease our GDP and it causes major problems for the economy. So that's why cyclical unemployment is bad. Now the last is seasonal unemployment. Seasonal unemployment just means that at different times of the year, different skills are in demand. So obviously if you work at a fireworks stand, there's not much demand for your skills in February because nobody's buying fireworks in February. But if you wanted to work at a flower store in February, there's going to be a lot of demand for your skills. The reason why is because February is when we have Valentine's Day, and a lot of people buy flowers on Valentine's Day. So seasonal work is just people whose jobs come and go depending on the time of year. All right, nominal versus real GDP. Hopefully you remember that nominal GDP means GDP that is not adjusted for inflation. It's GDP calculated using the prices from this year. This is not a good measure of our productivity because inflation distorts our perception of how much we created this year relative to years that came in the past. So economists care more about what's known as real GDP. Real GDP means GDP that's adjusted for inflation. In other words, it's GDP calculated using prices from a base year. Hopefully you all remember what a base year means. That's the year from which we start counting to make a price index. Now, this is our very best indication of economic productivity. Remember, I said real GDP shows us how many goods and services have been produced in our country within a year. So when economists look at GDP, they don't care about the dollars. The dollars are the least important thing to them. What economists really care about is using those dollars as a measure of how much stuff we produced, how many goods and services were created. All right, inflation. Now, inflation is the enemy of your money, okay? Inflation just eats up your money like you see in this political cartoon. So you can see that inflation is a big old fat rat, and he's he's biting chunks out of our money. So what that means is now our money's not going to do as much as it could before, and that's what inflation is. Inflation is a general increase in the cost of goods and services, and it unfortunately causes our money to lose purchasing power. That means value. So the higher inflation goes, the less your money can buy. So therefore, it'll take more money to buy the same stuff that you bought last year because the prices of those things are higher. This is why generally inflation is considered really negative, especially if inflation starts getting out of control. Now, the Consumer Price Index is how we measure inflation. It's a measure of the cost of living for a typical urban family of 4. Now, the way we calculate it is we use a metaphorical market basket of goods and services that are typically purchased by households. Things like housing, clothing, food, communications, recreation, all the different things that a household buys. Once we calculate how much all of those products cost, we can track how the price of those things changes from year to year. And so when we're looking at CPI, it's very important to remember that the base year for our CPI is always going to have a value of 100. As a matter of fact, if you ever see a CPI number that's equal to 100, you don't even have to think about it. That automatically is your base year. Once you know the base year, you can calculate the CPI of pretty much any other year that comes after that. What you need to do is take the cost of the market basket of goods in the year that you're looking at and divide it by the cost of the market basket in the base year. Then you multiply the result by 100, and that will give you your price index number. Once you know the price index number for another year, you can actually calculate how much inflation has occurred between that year and the base year. All you have to do to measure inflation from the base year is subtract the value of the base year CPI from the value of the year in question. So for example, if year 2 is 125 for our CPI value and the base year is equal to 100, we would do 125 minus 100, which would give us 25. And so that would mean that there's been 25% inflation since the base year. So very simple equation here. Just subtract 100 from whatever CPI number you're looking at, and that will tell you how much inflation has occurred since the base year. All right. Now, you might be asking yourself, Mr. White, why do prices have to rise? Why does inflation happen? Remember, we've got 2 basic theories of inflation. There's really a third, but it's okay, you don't need to know it for the test. So let's just talk about the 2 that are going to be on the test. The demand pull theory versus the cost push theory of inflation. The demand pull theory of inflation, you can actually see the graph just right over here on the left. This is our demand pull graph. I'm kind of circling it for us, okay? Demand pull inflation means that when consumer demand increases, prices have to rise in order to allow our quantity supplied to rise and match quantity demanded. This helps us avoid a shortage. So like you see on our graph down here, D1 shifted to D2. When that happened, we created a new equilibrium price, which is higher than the original price. So that's a cause of inflation. Now, another cause of inflation is what we call cost push inflation. Cost push inflation means that sometimes the price of inputs goes up. Inputs is another name for intermediate goods. Remember, those things don't count in our GDP. But when input costs go up, businesses are forced to increase the price of their goods and services. Now, when that happens, we're going to see our supply curve shift to the left, just like you see right over here, okay? This is cost push inflation. Supply curve shifts from S1 to S2, and when that happens, once again, it's going to cause an increase in price. And the point of this, again, is to prevent a shortage. If they didn't allow the price to rise, we would have a shortage of whatever this good or service is. So, demand pull inflation is caused by a rightward shift of the demand curve, and cost push inflation is caused by a leftward shift of the supply curve. Now, what kind of things are excluded from GDP? Well, one of the biggest things that's excluded from our count of GDP is what we call transfer payments, like for example stocks and bonds. Stocks and bonds don't count towards our GDP because that's just basically handing money from one person to another. Same thing is true about Social Security. When your grandma gets a Social Security check, essentially that's just young people who work giving money to old people who are retired. No good or service was created, and that's why we don't want to count it in our GDP, because hopefully you remember GDP is a measure of productivity. So if no good or service was created, we don't want to count that. Now, something else that we really can't count in our GDP, even though we are creating goods and services, is the informal economy. Goods or services that are generated but not recorded by the government. Like for example, if you mow your own lawn this weekend, I'm pretty sure the government's not going to know that unless you report it to them, and I don't see why you would. So we can't really keep track of the informal economy, things that people do for themselves or things that you do for your neighbors. Like for example, maybe if you babysit your neighbor's kids and they pay you $50, you're probably not going to report that to the government because you'd have to pay taxes on it. And so for that reason, the government can't keep track of it and add it to our GDP. Now, other things that can be sold are sometimes not reported to the government because they're illegal. So illegal goods and services that are sold in the black market, like drugs, those things don't count towards our GDP either, because obviously, once again, we have no way of knowing how many were sold. Now, the last thing is resale items, used items. Goods and services that have already been sold once do not count towards our GDP. Like if you go to GameStop and buy a used PlayStation Portable, the used PlayStation is not going to count towards our GDP because it has already been counted once before. Whenever that was first sold as a brand new item, we counted it in our GDP. And so now we don't want to count it again, because just like counting intermediate goods or transfer payments, that would distort our perception of how many goods and services we actually produced in our country this year. And of course, you should remember, GDP is a reflection of how many goods and services we produced in our country this year. Please don't forget that. Now, complete the sentence. This is easy stuff, okay? First thing, when the economy is working efficiently, we call that full employment. Full employment is about 4 to 6%. So 4 to 6% of the labor force is unemployed when the economy is working efficiently. Now, I know you might be thinking, but Mr. White, why don't we have 0% unemployment? Remember, that's not a realistic goal. To get to 0% unemployment, that would have to mean that every single person who wants a job has a job. And even though that sounds good, it's really bad. It leads to runaway inflation, and it makes it impossible for businesses to grow because businesses can't find anybody to work for them. And they have to pay all of their employees way more money just to keep them from leaving. Because if they leave, they're not going to be replaceable, right? This is why inflation goes up, because it forces input costs to go up on a business. So 0% unemployment is not a good thing. The perfect rate of unemployment for our economy is anywhere between 4 to 6%. Okay? Now, a country is said to have more stable prices if they have a low inflation rate. So if you see a question on the test, who knows, you just might, where it has countries and it shows their inflation rate, you want to look for the country with the lowest inflation rate. And that's going to be the country with the most stable prices. It means their prices are not changing very quickly. Now, one complete business cycle is measured from trough to trough. Remember, from the low point to the low point. So when I look for a complete business cycle, I'm looking for like a camel hump, right? Where it goes low, high, low. That's one complete business cycle. Generally, that process takes about 5 to 7 years to play out. And last thing you need to know is the formula for calculating the consumer price index. We've already gone over this once. Remember the CPI, you just take year 2 divided by year 1, which is your base year. And when we talk about year 1, year 2, we're talking about the cost of the market basket of goods in year 2 and the cost of the market basket of goods in your base year, year 1. And then once you figure that out, you multiply by 100, and that'll tell you your CPI number. So, for example, in your test review, there's a little part right below this. So what am I talking about? Let's just go to the next slide and we'll look at an example of how to use this CPI formula to calculate the CPI. Okay, so here we are. So this is exactly what you'll see on the back of your yellow sheet. We've got a little table here that shows some fictional market basket and CPI numbers for the years 2005 through 2015. Okay, so you'll see that in 2005, the market basket of goods cost $2,000. In 2010, the market basket was $3,000. And then in 2015, the market basket cost $4,000. So to figure out our CPI in 2010, what we need to do is identify the base year. You can see that in 2005, the CPI is equal to 100. So that automatically tells us, we don't even have to think about it, 2005 is our base year. So what we do is we take the market basket cost in 2010 and we divide it by the market basket cost in 2005. So 3,000 divided by 2,000 gives us 1.5. Now we take 1.5 and we're going to multiply by 100. 1.5 times 100 is equal to 150. So therefore, the CPI for 2010 is 150. Okay, you follow me so far? Now, for the next part, it wants to know how much inflation occurred between 2005 and 2015. Well, since we know that 2005 is our base year, right, we're basically saying how much inflation occurred between 2015 and the base year. Simple, simple, simple. All we need to do is take the CPI cost from 2015, or not cost, excuse me, the CPI number from 2015, which is 200, minus the CPI from the base year, which is 100. 200 minus 100 is 100. So therefore, we've had 100% inflation since the base year. So between 2005 and 2015, prices have essentially doubled. That's how we use the CPI to not only calculate inflation, but also to calculate to calculate inflation. I was going to say how prices are changing. But we know inflation means how prices are changing. So yeah, it's late in the day, guys. I think it's time for me to go home. But before I can go home, we got to talk about the short answer, right? Now, you need to be able to draw a business cycle for the short answer. And I'm helping you out. Check it out. There's a business cycle on your screen right now. As a matter of fact, if your business cycle looks exactly like this, my God, you're going to get full points for drawing the business cycle. That's worth 4 points of your 10-point short answer. Now, the other parts, I'm not going to directly tell you the answer to, but I bet you if you go back through this video one more time, you'll hear the answer to 1, 2, and 3, or I guess on yours it's A, B, and C. So you draw your correctly labeled business cycle, just like you see here, and then you're going to answer these questions. Number 1, how is the unemployment rate likely to change in each phase of the business cycle? What I'm asking for is, how does unemployment change in the expansion? So what's happening to the unemployment rate when the economy is expanding? What happens to the unemployment rate when the economy reaches its peak? What happens when we go into a recession or a contraction? And then what happens when we hit the trough? All you got to do is just tell me whether unemployment is going up or whether it's going down or whether it's staying the same and not going up or down. I think it's pretty simple. Go back, watch this video again, you'll see the answer. Now, what type or types of unemployment are most common at the peak of the business cycle? And you need to explain why. Well, just think about what would our unemployment rate possibly be at the peak. It's going to be the lowest our unemployment rate can be. So, what kinds of unemployment are always present in the economy? Just think about that for a minute. Go back and look at our slide about unemployment, and maybe, just maybe, you'll see an answer, okay? Now, last off, how does the business cycle illustrate the concept of economic productivity? We've talked a lot about GDP, and we've talked about what that means to economists. So, gosh, I don't know what GDP or productivity has to do with this particular graph, but if you study it and look at it long enough, or even go back and watch this video one more time, who knows? Maybe you'll see that answer as well. So, guys, this is an easy short answer. You're seeing exactly what the short answer is going to be before the test, so you would be kind of foolish to not make sure that you get full points on this FRQ, short answer, whatever you want to call it. But my God, guys, there's no reason why you shouldn't get this right. Please get it right. Of course, if you want to do well on this test, you're going to need to study, so make sure you study this information. But other than that, guys, good luck on the test, and I'll see you next time.